The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red ceremonial uniform for what he knew would be another routine day of guard duty. He had been serving as a royal guard for 3 years now, and the precision, discipline, and unwavering stillness required for the position had become second nature to him. His polished black boots reflected the early light as he took his position outside the palace gates, his tall black bearskin hat perfectly positioned, his face a mask of stoic concentration. James came from a working-class family in Manchester. His father had been a factory worker, his mother a school teacher, and they had instilled in him values of hard work, respect, and service to others. When he was 18, the military seemed like the natural path forward. The Royal Guards were an elite unit, and earning his place among them had required years of training, both physical and mental. Standing motionless for hours, ignoring distractions, maintaining perfect posture regardless of weather conditions. These were not just job requirements, but a source of personal pride. On this particular Tuesday morning, something felt different in the air. There had been whispers among the staff about a special diplomatic visit, but James had learned long ago not to pay attention to palace gossip. His job was simple: stand guard, protect the royal family and their property, and maintain the dignity of his position no matter what happened around him. The tourists began arriving earlier than usual. Families with cameras, school groups on educational trips, and curious visitors from around the world gathered behind the metal barriers, pointing and taking photographs of the guards. James had grown accustomed to being a living statue, a symbol of British tradition and military excellence. Children would sometimes try to make him smile or laugh. Adults would pose next to him for pictures, but nothing ever broke his concentration. Around mid-morning, a different kind of visitor approached the palace gates. James noticed him immediately, not because the man was causing any disturbance, but because of the way he carried himself. The stranger was tall, probably in his late 20s, with short-cropped brown hair and a bearing that suggested military training. He wore civilian clothes, dark jeans, a simple gray t-shirt, and well-worn leather boots. But something about his posture, the way his eyes scanned the surroundings, and his confident stride marked him as a fellow serviceman. The young man stopped about 10 feet away from James's position and simply stood there, looking directly at him. Not with the curious gaze of a tourist or the casual interest of a passerby, but with the intense, unwavering stare of someone who understood what it meant to stand at attention, to maintain discipline under pressure, to represent something larger than oneself. James felt the weight of that gaze but remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead according to his training. Yet something about this encounter was different from the hundreds of similar moments he had experienced. There was a recognition in the stranger's eyes, a kind of silent communication that spoke of shared experiences, of understanding what it meant to serve in uniform, to put duty before comfort, country before self. The stranger's stance was relaxed but alert, his hands clasped behind his back in a position that James recognized as a military rest position. This was not someone trying to break a guard's composure for entertainment or to test his limits. This was someone who respected what James represented and was paying his own form of tribute through silent acknowledgement. Minutes passed. The usual flow of tourists continued around them, but James became increasingly aware of this singular presence. The man never moved from his spot, never shifted his weight, never looked away. His eyes held a story that James could not yet read. But something in that steady gaze suggested experiences that went far beyond anything James had encountered in his relatively peaceful service. As the morning progressed, James began to notice small details about the stranger. There was a small scar above his left eyebrow, barely visible but suggesting some kind of past injury. His hands, when they briefly moved to adjust his position, showed calluses that spoke of hard physical work and training. Most telling of all was the way he held himself, with the kind of unconscious discipline that only came from years of military service, but also with something else, something that suggested he had seen action beyond the ceremonial duties that comprised James's own experience. The clock tower chimed 11, then quarter past, then half past. Still the stranger remained, and still James maintained his position, but now there was an electric tension in the air between them. Other tourists came and went, guides led their groups past, palace staff moved about their duties, but these two men remained locked in their silent confrontation, each recognizing something in the other that transcended words. James found his mind wandering despite his training, wondering about the man's story. Was he British military, foreign, active duty, or veteran? What had brought him here, and why had he chosen to engage in this wordless exchange? The questions multiplied, but James's discipline held firm. Whatever was happening here, whatever this moment meant, he would not be the first to break. The stranger's expression never changed, but there was something in his eyes that seemed to grow more intense as time passed. Not challenging or hostile, but deeply serious, as if this silent standoff carried weight far beyond what any observer might understand. James sensed that this was more than curiosity or respect. This was something personal, something that mattered deeply to the man standing before him. As the sun climbed higher and the morning moved toward afternoon, both men remained motionless, locked in their silent communion, each waiting to see what the other was made of, each honoring the other's service in the only way possible without breaking the sacred rules that governed their respective positions. The real test was just beginning. The stranger standing before James was Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, and his presence at Buckingham Palace was not accidental. 3 days earlier, he had arrived in London as part of a joint military exchange program between the United States Marine Corps and British forces. What was supposed to be a routine diplomatic visit had become something much more personal when he learned about the Royal Guards and their legendary discipline. Marcus came from a very different world than James. He had grown up in East Los Angeles, where his Mexican immigrant parents had worked multiple jobs to keep their family afloat. His father was a construction worker who left for job sites before dawn. His mother cleaned office buildings during night shifts. For Marcus, the military had been both an escape from limited opportunities and a way to serve the country that had given his family a chance at a better life. But Marcus's military service had been far from ceremonial. He had completed 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan, where he had served as a squad leader in some of the most dangerous regions of Helmand province. He had seen friends wounded and killed, had made split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death, and had experienced the kind of pressure that most people could never imagine. The discipline required for combat was different from ceremonial duty, but Marcus recognized that both demanded the same core qualities: mental toughness, unwavering focus, and the ability to maintain composure when everything around you was chaos. Standing there looking at James, Marcus saw something he rarely encountered anymore: pure, unbending discipline without the edge of combat experience. There was something almost innocent about it, and yet he respected it deeply. This British Guard represented tradition, ceremony, and the kind of service that protected not through violence, but through presence, through symbolic strength, through the simple act of standing watch. Marcus had come to Buckingham Palace initially just as a tourist, curious about the famous guards he had heard so much about. But when he saw James take his position that morning, something clicked. Here was a fellow serviceman, someone who understood duty and sacrifice, even if their experiences were vastly different. The decision to stay, to engage in this silent test of wills, had been instinctive. As noon approached, the sun grew warmer and the crowd of tourists grew larger. Marcus could see small beads of sweat forming on James's forehead beneath the heavy bearskin hat, but the guard never moved, never gave any sign of discomfort. Marcus himself was beginning to feel the strain of maintaining his position, but his pride as a Marine would not allow him to be the first to break. A group of American tourists recognized Marcus's military bearing and began speculating loudly about whether he was trying to make the guard laugh or break his composure. $20 says he can't last another 10 minutes, one of them said, completely missing the serious nature of what was actually happening. Marcus ignored them completely, just as James ignored the constant chatter and camera clicks from the crowd. An elderly British gentleman in a well-tailored suit approached and stood quietly nearby for several minutes, watching the two men with understanding eyes. Eventually, he moved closer to Marcus and spoke in a low voice that only he could hear. "Royal Navy." "Retired," the man said simply. "Served on destroyers during the Falklands. That young man has been standing there for nearly 4 hours without moving. You've been here for 2. This isn't a game anymore, is it?" Marcus glanced briefly at the older man, recognizing a fellow veteran but said nothing, and returned his gaze to James. The elderly man nodded approvingly and moved away, but not before adding, "Carry on, both of you. Some things matter more than comfort." The afternoon heat was building, and both men were now visibly struggling with the physical demands of their self-imposed challenge. James's legs ached, his back was stiff, and the heavy wool uniform was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. But his training held, and more importantly, his pride would not allow him to show weakness in front of this American who clearly understood what it meant to serve. Marcus, despite his combat experience and physical conditioning, was finding the stationary position more challenging than he had expected. His legs were beginning to shake slightly, and he had to consciously control his breathing to maintain his composure. But every time he thought about shifting his weight or taking a break, he looked into James's unwavering eyes and found new resolve. Around 2 in the afternoon, something changed in the atmosphere around them. The casual tourists began to notice that something significant was happening. Word spread through the crowd that the American had been standing there for hours, that this was some kind of contest or demonstration of military discipline. People began taking videos, posting on social media, and calling their friends to come witness what was becoming an impromptu display of military endurance. Palace security had been monitoring the situation since Marcus first took his position, but they recognized that nothing threatening was occurring. Both men were clearly military, both were showing respect rather than causing disruption, and the growing crowd was actually well-behaved and interested rather than rowdy. Still, they remained alert, ready to intervene if the situation changed. James became aware of the increased attention, but refused to let it affect his concentration. If anything, the knowledge that people were watching, that his performance reflected not just on himself, but on the entire Royal Guard, strengthened his resolve. He thought about his training, about the generations of guards who had stood in this same spot before him, about the honor of his position and the trust that had been placed in him. Marcus, too, felt the weight of representation. He was not just an individual Marine anymore. He was representing his entire service branch, his country, and the values that had been instilled in him through years of training and combat experience. The thought of backing down, of being the first to break, was unthinkable. As the afternoon wore on, both men entered a kind of meditative state, focusing not on the discomfort in their bodies, but on something deeper, their commitment to duty, their respect for each other, and their determination to honor the service they both represented. The physical challenge was becoming secondary to something more profound, a test of character that would determine not who was stronger, but who was more committed to the principles that defined them as military men. The crowd continued to grow, and with it, the pressure on both men to maintain their positions and their dignity. What had begun as a simple moment of recognition between two servicemen was becoming something much larger, a demonstration that would be remembered long after both men had moved on from this place. Neither of them fully understood yet how this encounter would change them, but both sensed that they were participating in something significant, something that would test everything they believed about themselves and their service. By 3 in the afternoon, the silent standoff between James and Marcus had attracted attention far beyond the usual tourist crowd. News crews had arrived after someone posted a viral video on social media showing the American Marine and British Royal Guard locked in their motionless confrontation. What had started as a personal moment between two servicemen was now being broadcast live on BBC News and CNN, with commentators speculating about the meaning behind this unprecedented display of military discipline. James could hear the growing buzz of conversation around him, the clicking of cameras, and the voices of reporters, but his training kept his focus razor-sharp on the man in front of him. The physical pain had moved beyond mere discomfort. His legs were cramping, his shoulders ached from maintaining perfect posture, and the heavy ceremonial uniform felt like it weighed twice its normal amount. But something had happened during those hours of staring into Marcus's eyes that went far deeper than physical endurance. In Marcus's steady gaze, James had begun to see reflections of experiences he had never encountered but somehow understood. There was a weight in the American's eyes that spoke of decisions made under fire, of responsibility for other men's lives, of the kind of pressure that came not from standing still, but from moving forward when everything inside you wanted to retreat. James realized he was not just facing another soldier. He was facing someone who had tested his courage in ways James had never been asked to do. Marcus, for his part, was discovering something equally profound in James's unwavering composure. The British Guard's discipline was not the reactive, survival-focused control that Marcus had developed in combat, but something more refined and deliberate. It was the discipline of ceremony, of tradition, of maintaining standards, not because lives depended on it in the immediate sense, but because the integrity of institutions and the honor of service depended on it. Marcus found himself respecting this different but equally demanding form of military excellence. The crowd had grown so large that additional police officers had been called to manage the flow of people and ensure public safety. Among the spectators were several off-duty servicemen and veterans who understood better than the casual observers what they were witnessing. These men and women stood quietly at the edges of the crowd, their own military bearing visible as they watched two of their brothers push themselves to their limits. A retired British Army colonel named William Hartwell had been among the crowd for the past hour, having heard about the situation from a former colleague. He watched the two young men with a mixture of admiration and concern, recognizing both the honor in what they were doing and the potential danger of pushing physical endurance too far. He had seen young soldiers injure themselves by refusing to acknowledge their limits, and he began to consider whether intervention might be necessary. Around 4 o'clock, James began to experience moments of lightheadedness. The combination of standing motionless for over 6 hours, wearing the heavy uniform in increasingly warm weather, and the intense mental concentration required to maintain his position was taking a serious toll. But each time his resolve wavered, he looked into Marcus's eyes and saw the same determination that kept him upright. Neither man was willing to be the first to show weakness. Marcus was fighting his own battle with exhaustion and physical stress. His combat experience had taught him to push through pain and discomfort, but this was different from anything he had encountered. In Afghanistan, action and movement had provided outlets for adrenaline and nervous energy. Here, the challenge was purely mental, the ability to remain still, to maintain composure, to honor his commitment without any external validation or immediate purpose other than the respect between two warriors. The media coverage was expanding beyond just news outlets. Military historians were being interviewed about the significance of military discipline, Psychologists were discussing the mental fortitude required for such displays, and former servicemen were sharing their own stories of endurance and commitment. What James and Marcus had started as a personal moment of mutual recognition was becoming a symbol of military values and dedication that resonated with people around the world. Social media was filled with messages of support from military families, veterans, and civilians who were inspired by the display of discipline and mutual respect. Guard V's Marine began trending globally, but the tone of most posts was not competitive. It was admiring, respectful, and grateful for the reminder of what military service represented. As the afternoon progressed, both men entered a state that transcended normal physical awareness. The pain in their bodies became background noise to a deeper focus on what this moment represented. For James, it was about proving that ceremonial duty required just as much strength and commitment as combat service. For Marcus, it was about honoring the different but equally valid forms that military excellence could take. Around 5 in the evening, something shifted in the dynamic between them. Without breaking their stare or changing their positions, both men seemed to reach an understanding that this was no longer about who could last longer. It had become a shared meditation on service, duty, and the bonds that connected military personnel across all branches and nations. They were no longer competing against each other. They were supporting each other in a demonstration of what it meant to be a warrior in any context. The crowd had grown quieter as the hours passed, sensing that they were witnessing something sacred. Even the reporters were speaking in hushed tones, and the photographers were being more careful not to disturb the solemnity of the moment. Children who had been fidgety earlier were now sitting quietly with their parents, somehow understanding that something important was happening, even if they could not fully comprehend what it was. Colonel Hartwell approached one of the palace security officers and had a quiet conversation about the welfare of both men. Medical personnel were discreetly positioned nearby, ready to intervene if either man showed signs of serious distress. But both James and Marcus continued to show remarkable composure, their breathing steady, their postures unwavering despite the obvious physical strain. As the sun began to lower in the sky, casting longer shadows across the courtyard, both men knew they were approaching a moment of decision. They had proven whatever needed to be proven, demonstrated whatever needed to be demonstrated. The question was no longer who was stronger or more disciplined. The question was how to honor what they had shared and bring this extraordinary encounter to a conclusion that respected both of their services and the moment they had created together. The real test was no longer physical endurance. It was wisdom, knowing when strength meant holding on and when it meant letting go. As 6 o'clock approached, the golden hour light of late afternoon cast both men in a warm glow that seemed to highlight the significance of what had transpired between them. James and Marcus had been locked in their silent confrontation for over 7 hours, and both had transcended the physical discomfort to reach a place of mutual understanding that neither had expected when the day began. The crowd had remained remarkably respectful throughout the afternoon, but now there was a palpable sense that something needed to change. Medical personnel had been monitoring both men from a distance, and while neither showed signs of immediate distress, the prolonged physical strain was clearly taking its toll. Both were showing signs of fatigue, dehydration, and the kind of exhaustion that came from maintaining perfect control for an extended period. It was Marcus who made the first move, but not in the way anyone expected. Without breaking eye contact with James, he slowly and deliberately brought his right hand up to his forehead in a crisp military salute. Not the casual gesture of acknowledgement, but the full, formal salute that one serviceman gives to another in recognition of their service, their sacrifice, and their commitment to something greater than themselves. The gesture was so unexpected and so perfectly executed that it took James's breath away. In that moment, he understood that Marcus was not conceding defeat or admitting weakness. He was offering the highest honor that one military person could give to another. formal recognition of their worthiness, their courage, and their dedication to duty. James felt something break open in his chest, a flood of emotion that he had not experienced since the day he first put on the uniform of the Royal Guard. This American Marine, this battle-tested warrior who had seen combat and faced dangers James could only imagine, was saluting him. Not his rank, not his position, but him personally, as a fellow servant of his country and his values. The protocol of his position demanded that James remain motionless, that he not respond to any gesture or provocation while on duty. But in that moment, James understood that there were times when the spirit of service transcended the letter of regulation. Slowly, with the same deliberate precision that Marcus had shown, James brought his own hand up in a return salute, acknowledging not just Marcus but everything he represented, the courage of warriors who face enemy fire, the sacrifice of those who serve in dangerous places, and the brotherhood that connected all who chose to put duty before personal comfort. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, but it was not the cheering of spectators at a sporting event. It was the deep, respectful appreciation of people who understood they had witnessed something rare and beautiful. Two men from different countries, different services, and different backgrounds finding common ground in their shared commitment to service and honor. The formal exchange of salutes lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like a ceremony that had been years in the making. Both men slowly lowered their hands and took their first steps away from the positions they had held for so long. James moved with the careful precision of someone whose muscles had been locked in place for hours, while Marcus walked with the measured pace of a Marine who never showed weakness, even when his body was screaming for rest. They met in the middle of the space between them, and for the first time they spoke. "Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, United States Marine Corps," Marcus said, extending his hand with a slight smile that transformed his serious expression into something warm and human. "Sergeant James Mitchell, Grenadier Guards," James replied, grasping Marcus's hand in a firm handshake that conveyed respect, gratitude, and a kind of brotherhood that transcended nationality or service branch. "That was 7 hours and 23 minutes, Marcus said, his voice showing the strain of the afternoon but also carrying a note of amazement. "I've never met anyone with that kind of discipline outside of combat. And I've never met anyone who could maintain that kind of focus without military regulation requiring it," James responded. "You didn't have to stay. You chose to." The two men stood there for a moment, both swaying slightly as their bodies adjusted to being able to move again, both processing what they had shared. Around them, the crowd was beginning to disperse, but many people lingered, taking pictures and discussing what they had witnessed. Colonel Hartwell approached them with 2 bottles of water and the kind of understanding smile that only came from decades of military service. "Gentlemen," he said, "that was one of the finest displays of military bearing and mutual respect I've seen in 40 years of service. Your respective services should be proud." Both men accepted the water gratefully, drinking deeply as their bodies began to remember basic needs like hydration and rest. A representative from the palace approached and informed them that their demonstration had been watched around the world, that social media was filled with positive responses from military personnel and civilians alike, and that both the British Ministry of Defense and the United States Department of Defense had issued statements praising their professionalism and the positive image they had created for international military cooperation. Marcus looked at James with genuine curiosity. "What made you decide to return my salute? I know you're not supposed to break protocol while on duty." James thought for a moment before answering. "Some things are more important than protocol. What we shared out there, that was about more than following rules. That was about honoring what we both represent. I couldn't let that moment pass without acknowledging it properly." As the evening approached, both men were approached by reporters, military officials, and members of the public who wanted to understand what had motivated them to engage in such an extraordinary display. But both James and Marcus deflected most of the attention, emphasizing that what they had done was simply an expression of the values that all military personnel shared: discipline, respect, commitment, and the willingness to push beyond personal comfort in service of something greater. 3 months later, Marcus returned to London for the formal conclusion of his exchange program. He and James had maintained correspondence, sharing stories about their respective services and their lives beyond the military. When Marcus visited Buckingham Palace again, James was off duty, and the two men spent the afternoon exploring London together, talking about their experiences, their hopes for their futures, and the strange day when they had found brotherhood in silence. Years later, both men would look back on that afternoon as a defining moment in their military careers, not because of any medal or promotion it earned them, but because it reminded them why they had chosen to serve in the first place. It had been a demonstration that the values they held dear, honor, commitment, respect, and brotherhood, were not just abstract concepts, but living realities that could transform strangers into brothers and turn a simple moment of recognition into something that inspired people around the world. The story of the Marine and the Royal Guard who stared each other down became a legend in military circles, passed down as an example of what it truly meant to serve with honor. But for James and Marcus, it would always be something simpler and more personal. The day they discovered that respect, courage, and commitment could create bonds that transcended every difference between them, and that sometimes the greatest strength was found not in fighting against each other, but in standing together.